Time has a way of teaching the hardest lessons when we least expect them. For James Miller, a 72-year-old retired construction foreman, that lesson began with what he dismissed as simple heartburn. A man who had built skyscrapers with his bare hands, weathered economic downturns, and raised 3 children on his own after his wife's passing, wasn't about to let a little chest discomfort slow him down. His children called it stubbornness. He called it strength. But strength can be a double-edged sword, especially when it masks something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. In the sterile confines of a small medical clinic in suburban Chicago, what started as a routine checkup was about to turn into a race against time. One test result would shatter the illusion of invulnerability that James had built around himself for decades, forcing a proud man to confront not just his own mortality, but the true meaning of family and second chances. This isn't just another medical emergency story. This is about how 4 minutes of denial nearly cost 3 generations of Millers their patriarch, and how sometimes the bravest thing a strong man can do is admit he needs help. What follows is the story of 72 crucial seconds that would forever change one family's definition of what it truly means to be strong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of James Miller's workshop, casting long shadows across the weathered workbench where he'd spent countless hours fixing everything from broken chairs to his grandchildren's toys. The familiar scent of sawdust and machine oil filled the air as he bent over his granddaughter Emma's purple bicycle, his calloused hands carefully adjusting the chain. A dull ache pressed against his chest, the 3rd time this week. But he dismissed it with a grunt and reached for his wrench. "Just need to get moving," he muttered to himself, rolling his shoulders back. The discomfort had become a frequent companion lately, but James had never been one to let a little pain slow him down. Not when he was overseeing the construction of Chicago's tallest buildings, and certainly not now, when his 7-year-old granddaughter was counting on him to fix her favorite bike before summer vacation. The workshop, a converted garage attached to his modest suburban home, was his sanctuary. Every tool had its place, each surface marked with the stories of projects completed over decades. On the wall hung a faded photograph from 1985. James, standing proud atop the steel framework of the Morrison building, the city sprawling beneath him. He'd been different then. Younger, of course, but just as stubborn. Margaret used to say he was made of steel himself, though her eyes would crinkle with worry whenever he'd come home with bruised knuckles and aching joints. A sharper pain lanced through his chest, forcing him to lean against the workbench. Through the window, he could see his daughter Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. She'd been dropping by more frequently lately, her visits thinly veiled wellness checks that he pretended not to notice. The pain subsided just as the side door opened. "Dad." Sarah's voice carried that familiar note of concern. "Emma's been asking about her bike all morning." James straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Almost done. Just needed a new chain and some oil. Good as new in 10 minutes. Sarah stepped into the workshop, her eyes scanning his face. At 43, she was the spitting image of her mother, same worried expression too. "You're looking a bit pale. Have you eaten today?" "Course I have," he lied, turning back to the bike. "Had breakfast at 6, same as always." The truth was, he'd skipped breakfast, the thought of food making his stomach turn. But Sarah didn't need to know that. She had enough on her plate with her teaching job and single motherhood. The morning light caught the gold of her wedding ring, the one she still wore 3 years after the divorce. Some habits were hard to break, James supposed, just like his own habit of pushing through pain, of standing tall when his body begged him to rest. "We're having a family dinner tonight," Sarah announced, moving closer to inspect his work on the bike. "Michael's bringing the kids, and Lisa's driving in from Milwaukee." James paused, his hand tightening on the wrench. All 3 of his children in one place usually meant some kind of intervention was brewing. What's the occasion? Does there need to be one? Sarah's attempt at casualness fell flat. It's been a while since we were all together. The pain in his chest flared again, stronger this time, spreading down his left arm. James set the wrench down carefully, hoping Sarah wouldn't notice the tremor in his hand. He thought about Margaret, about the promise he'd made by her hospital, bed 5 years ago. "Take care of yourself," she'd said, her voice barely a whisper. They still need their father, but he was fine, had to be fine. The Miller family needed its patriarch, not another burden to bear. "Dad?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you sure you're okay?" James forced a smile, picking up the wrench again. "Never better, sweetheart. Just thinking about what to make for dinner. Your mother's lasagna recipe might be nice." Sarah's expression softened at the mention of Margaret, though the worry didn't leave her eyes. "Let me help. You've been out here all morning." "Almost done," James insisted, turning back to Emma's bike. The pain was still there, a steady pressure against his ribs, but he had work to finish. Steel doesn't bend, he reminded himself. Steel doesn't break. As Sarah reluctantly left the workshop, James caught his reflection in the window. A proud man of 72, his silver hair neatly combed, his shoulders still broad despite the years. But there was something else there too, something in his eyes that looked unsettlingly like fear. He pushed the thought away and focused on the bike. Chain, on the simple, fixable problems that had always made sense to him. The family dinner would be fine. He'd smile and joke, tell stories about the old days on the construction sites, and convince his children that their worry was unnecessary. He'd hide the pain that was becoming harder to ignore. The shortness of breath that woke him at night, the growing fear that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invincible as he'd always believed. After all, that's what strong men did. They carried on. They didn't burden others with their problems. They certainly didn't admit that something as simple as fixing a bicycle could leave them feeling like they'd run a marathon. James tightened the last bolt on Emma's bike, testing the chain's tension one final time. Perfect. Just like everything else in his life needed to be. The pain in his chest disagreed, but he'd gotten good at ignoring unwelcome truths. Steel doesn't bend, he thought again, straightening up despite the protest from his body. Steel doesn't break. But as he wheeled the bike toward the door, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a truth he wasn't ready to face. Sometimes the strongest steel is the kind that knows when it needs reinforcement. The aroma of baking lasagna filled James's kitchen, a scent that brought both comfort and an unexpected wave of melancholy. He'd followed Margaret's recipe to the letter, just as he had countless times since her passing. The familiar motions of layering pasta, sauce, and cheese had helped distract him from the persistent ache in his chest, though the heat from the oven wasn't helping matters. Sarah arrived first, Emma bouncing through the door with excited chatter about her newly repaired bike. Behind them came Michael, James's youngest, still wearing his police uniform from his shift. Lisa's arrival completed the family circle, her high heels clicking against the hardwood floors as she hugged her siblings. The sound of his grandchildren's laughter echoed through the house. Emma, Michael's boys, Tommy and Jack, and Lisa's teenager, Rachel. "Smells like Mum's cooking," Lisa said softly, helping James pull the lasagna from the oven. She caught him, wincing as he straightened up. "Dad, let me get that." "I've got it," he insisted, though the weight of the dish sent another sharp pain through his chest. "Been cooking longer than you've been alive." The dinner table had always been the heart of the Miller home. Margaret had insisted on Sunday dinners, even when the kids were teenagers with busy social lives. Now, looking at his family gathered around that same oak table, James felt her absence more keenly than ever. "So, Dad," Michael began, after the initial flurry of passing dishes had settled, "Sarah mentioned you've been spending a lot of time in the workshop lately." James recognized the tone, the same one Michael used when questioning suspects. Keep busy, keep young. That's what your mother always said. There's busy and there's overdoing it. Lisa chimed in, her corporate executive directness showing through. Mrs. Henderson next door said she saw you carrying lumber last week. In this heat? Mrs. Henderson should mind her own business, James muttered, pushing his food around his plate. The lasagna, usually his favorite, sat heavy in his stomach. Sarah set her fork down. Dad, we're worried. You're not as young as you used to be, and after what happened to Mom. Don't. James's voice carried a warning edge. Your mother's situation was different. Was it? Sarah pressed. She ignored the symptoms too. Kept saying she was fine until, that's enough. James stood abruptly, another spike of pain shooting through his chest. The room spun slightly, but he gripped the table edge, staying upright through sheer determination. The children fell silent, exchanging worried glances. Even the grandkids sensed the tension, their usual chatter subdued. Rachel, at 15, the oldest of the grandchildren, watched her grandfather with knowing eyes that reminded him too much of Margaret. James remembered the last time they'd all sat around this table with Margaret. She'd known something was wrong for months, but had kept it to herself, not wanting to worry anyone. By the time she finally saw a doctor, the cancer had spread too far. He'd promised her he wouldn't make the same mistake, but here he was, keeping his own health concerns locked, away behind a wall of pride. I made an appointment, Michael said quietly. Tomorrow morning at 9, Dr. Patterson's office. James felt the anger rise. You had no right. We had every right, Lisa interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. We're your children. We love you. And we're not losing another parent because of stubborn pride. The words hit harder than any physical pain. James looked at his family, really looked at them. Sarah, who'd practically raised her siblings after Margaret got sick. Michael, who'd chosen law enforcement because he wanted to protect others. Lisa, who'd fought her way to the top of her field while raising Rachel alone. They were strong, his children, strong in ways that had nothing to do with refusing help. Dad, Sarah said softly, reaching for his hand across the table. Remember what you always told us about the Morrison building. How every beam had to work together, had to be connected, or the whole thing would fall. James nodded, his throat tight. He'd used that metaphor countless times during their childhood. Well, you're our central beam, she continued, and if you won't let us help reinforce you, the whole family structure suffers. The pain in his chest throbbed in time with his heartbeat, as if his body was emphasizing Sarah's point. He thought of Margaret again, of the regret in her eyes when she realized how much time they'd lost to her silence. 9 o'clock? He finally asked, looking at Michael. His son nodded, relief visible on his face. I'll pick you up. I can drive myself. James started to protest, but the look on his children's faces stopped him. But I suppose you can tag along. The tension in the room eased slightly. Rachel got up to help clear the plates, while Tommy and Jack resumed their animated discussion about baseball. Emma climbed into James's lap, careful in the way children often are when they sense something. Important has happened, Grandpa, she whispered. Does your heart hurt like Grandma's did? The innocent question nearly broke him. He hugged her close, feeling the steady beat of her small heart against his chest. No, sweetheart, but Grandpa's going to make sure it stays strong. For all of you. Later that night, after the family had gone home, James stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection. The proud construction foreman stared back, but now he could see what his children had been seeing. The pallor in his cheeks, the slight slump in his shoulders, the fear he'd been trying so hard to hide. All right, Margaret, he whispered to the empty room. I hear you, I hear them. He opened the medicine cabinet and looked at the bottle of antacids he'd been using to fight the heartburn. Tomorrow, he'd get real answers whether he wanted them or not. Steel might not bend, but even the strongest structures needed maintenance. It had taken a family dinner and the memory of his wife to remind him of that simple truth. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect baseball weather. James sat in the bleachers at Wilson Park, watching Tommy warm up for his Little League game. He'd cancelled his doctor's appointment from yesterday, told Michael he was feeling better. It wasn't entirely a lie. The pain had subsided to a dull throb he could almost ignore. The familiar crack of bat-meeting ball echoed across the field. Tommy was up to bat, his small frame tense with concentration. James leaned forward, ignoring the tightness in his chest as he watched his grandson connect with the pitch, sending the ball soaring toward left field. "Run, Tommy! Run!" James called out, rising to his feet. The sudden movement sent a shock of pain through his body, sharper than anything he'd felt before. The world tilted sideways, the bright morning sun becoming a blinding glare. He could hear Michael's voice somewhere nearby, calling his name. The pain was different this time. Not just pressure, but a crushing weight, as if one of his old steel beams had fallen across his chest. His left arm felt heavy, useless. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear Emma screaming, "Grandpa!" The sound of his granddaughter's terror cut through his pride like a knife. "Dad!" Michael's face swam into view, features tight with fear. "Stay with me! Sarah's calling 911. James tried to speak, to tell them he just needed a minute to catch his breath, but the words wouldn't come. The bright blue sky above the baseball field began to darken at the edges. He could feel the rough wood of the bleachers. Against his back, hear the murmur of concerned parents gathering around. Through the gathering darkness, he saw Margaret's face, not as she looked at the end, worn down by illness, but as she'd been in their prime, laughing, vibrant, full of life. She seemed to be shaking her head at him, that familiar look of loving exasperation in her eyes. "Not yet, you stubborn old fool," he could almost hear her say. "They still need you." Tommy's baseball game faded into chaos around him. He was vaguely aware of Sarah gripping his hand, of Lisa's voice somewhere nearby, directing people to clear a path. The pride that had kept him standing all these months finally crumbled, replaced by a fear he couldn't fight anymore. "I'm sorry," he managed to whisper, though he wasn't sure if the words actually made it past his lips. "Sorry for scaring them. Sorry for not listening. Sorry for almost making them go through this again." The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was Michael's face, wearing the same expression James had worn at Margaret's bedside, the look of a man watching his parents' mortality unfold before his eyes. The roles had reversed, and there was nothing James could do but surrender to the darkness and pray he'd get a chance to make it right. The fluorescent lights of the urgent care clinic cast harsh shadows across Dr. Peterson's face as she pressed the cold stethoscope against James's chest. The ambulance crew had wanted to take him straight to the emergency room, but the clinic was closer, and James had regained consciousness enough to insist he was fine. A compromise that Sarah, her face still pale with fear, had reluctantly accepted. "Your heart rhythm's irregular, Mr. Miller," Dr. Peterson said, her young face carrying the weight of concern that seemed too heavy for her years. "How long have you been experiencing chest pain?" James felt his children's eyes on him. Michael stood by the door in his baseball dust-covered uniform, while Lisa gripped the back of Sarah's chair. No point in hiding it anymore. "Few months, maybe. Thought it was heartburn." The doctor's frown deepened. "I'm going to run an ECG. Nancy, can you set up the machine?" The nurse moved efficiently, attaching electrodes to James's chest while Dr. Peterson asked more questions. Yes, there had been shortness of breath. Yes, the pain sometimes radiated down his left arm. No, he hadn't thought it serious enough to mention to anyone. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. He couldn't meet her eyes. The ECG machine hummed to life, its steady beeping filling the small exam room. James watched Dr. Peterson's face as she studied the readout, saw the exact moment her professional composure slipped. She pressed a button. On the machine ran the test again. "Nancy," she said quietly, "call 911. Tell them we need advanced life support, priority 1. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What is it?" Michael stepped forward, police officer instincts kicking in. "What's wrong?" Dr. Peterson turned to James, her voice steady despite the urgency in her eyes. "Mr. Miller, you're having a heart attack. Not just now. From these readings, you've likely been having a series of small cardiac events over the past few months. The damage is significant. You need emergency intervention immediately." The words hit James like physical blows. Heart attack, damage, emergency. He thought of the construction site accidents he'd witnessed over the years, how time seemed to slow down just before disaster struck. It was slowing down now, stretching like steel under pressure. The hospital's cardiac team will be waiting, Dr. Peterson continued, already preparing medication. "Every minute counts here." Lisa's professional calm cracked. "Months? You've been having heart attacks for months and said nothing?" Before James could respond, the exam room burst into activity. Paramedics arrived with a stretcher, their urgent voices mixing with the doctor's rapid-fire medical terminology. Terms like ST elevation and myocardial infarction floated above him as they transferred him from the exam table. As they wheeled him out, James caught a glimpse of his grandchildren in the waiting room. Emma was crying in Sarah's arms, while Tommy and Jack huddled close to their father. Rachel, old enough to understand what was happening, had her mother's hand in a white-knuckled grip. "Your family is going to follow us to the hospital," one of the paramedics assured him as they loaded him into the ambulance. "Just focus on staying calm and breathing." James closed his eyes, feeling the vehicle lurch into motion. The sirens' wail seemed to echo the warning his body had been trying to give him for months. A warning his pride had refused to hear until it was almost too late. Now racing through the streets toward a future suddenly full of uncertainty, he realized that the true strength his family needed wasn't in his ability to endure pain, but in his willingness to admit when he needed help. The paramedic squeezed his hand. "Stay with us, Mr. Miller. Your family needs you to fight. Fight." That, at least, was something James Miller knew how to do. The ambulance tore through Chicago's streets, its siren parting traffic like waves. Inside, James drifted between clarity and confusion as the paramedics worked around him. A young woman, her name tag read Martinez, maintained a steady stream of conversation while checking his vitals. "Your BP's holding steady, Mr. Miller. That's good. The medication Dr. Peterson gave you is helping." She adjusted something on the IV line running into his arm. "Tell me about your grandkids, the little girl at the clinic. What's her name?" "Emma," James managed, his voice rough. "She's 7. Just fixed her bike yesterday." The memory of his workshop seemed distant now, like a scene from another life. Had it really been just yesterday? "Got it working good as new, did you?" Martinez's smile was genuine, though her eyes never stopped monitoring the equipment surrounding him. "What else did you fix up in that workshop of yours?" James recognized the tactic. Keep the patient talking, keep them engaged. He'd used similar techniques with injured workers on his construction sites. Still, he was grateful for the distraction from the burning in his chest and the fear he couldn't quite suppress. "Built a dollhouse last month for Tommy's sister. Jack, A wave of pain cut off his words, sharp enough to draw a gasp. "Mr. Miller?" Martinez's voice took on an edge of urgency. "What are you feeling?" "Pressure. Worse." The words came out strangled. The ambulance interior began to spin, lights blurring into streaks of color. "BP's dropping." Starting another line. "Johnson, radio ahead. Tell them we're 3 minutes out and patient's deteriorating." The siren's wail seemed to fade into the distance as darkness crept in from the edges of James's vision. He thought of Margaret again, of the promise he'd made. "Take care of yourself," she'd said. He was breaking that promise, just like he was. Breaking the one he'd made to himself, to always be strong for his family. "Stay with us, Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller." The ambulance doors burst open to organized chaos. Fluorescent lights strobed overhead as the stretcher rushed through hospital corridors, medical terms flying between the paramedics and hospital staff. 68-year-old male, multiple cardiac events. ST elevation in leads V1 through V4, BP 90/60 and falling. Get him to Cath Lab 2. Dr. Patel's team is waiting. James tried to focus on the faces above him, but they blurred together. Somewhere nearby he heard Sarah's voice. "Dad! We're here, Dad!" Then Michael's deeper tone. "Let them work, Sarah. Let them work." A new face appeared. A woman in surgical scrubs with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Miller, I'm Dr. Patel. We're taking you to the catheterization lab right now. We need to clear the blockages in your heart vessels. Immediately. Do you understand?" James managed a nod. The pain was everywhere now, radiating through his chest and down both arms. "Your family's right outside," Dr. Patel continued as they moved. "They'll be waiting when you're done. But right now, I need you to focus on breathing. Can you do that?" "For me," another nod. They passed through double doors into a room filled with equipment. The ceiling was a maze of lights and monitors. Medical staff moved with practiced efficiency, transferring him to the procedure table, attaching new monitors, prepping equipment. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Patel's voice cut through the fog of pain and fear. "We're going to give you something to help you relax, but I need you to stay awake for me. This procedure, we're going to thread a catheter through your blood vessels to your heart. We'll be able to see exactly what's happening and fix the blockages. You might feel some pressure, but no pain, okay?" James tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The medication was taking effect, dulling the edges of his pain. Through the haze, he heard a monitor's alarm, followed by Dr. Patel's sharp commands. "Vitak, push one of Epi, get the crash cart ready." The ceiling began to fade, darkness creeping in despite his struggle to keep his eyes open. Somewhere in that darkness, Margaret waited, but Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "They still need their father. Fighting V-fib, starting compressions." The darkness receded slightly. James felt pressure on his chest, someone doing CPR. He'd been certified in it himself, had used it twice on his job sites. Never thought he'd be on the receiving end. "Come on, Mr. Miller, stay with us." He thought of his family waiting outside. Sarah, Michael, Lisa, his grandchildren, all the moments he might miss. Emma learning to ride her newly fixed bike, Tommy's baseball games, Rachel's graduation. He wasn't ready to leave them, not like this, not today. Rhythm's back, still. Critical, but he's fighting. "Good man, Mr. Miller, keep fighting." The darkness retreated further. James forced his eyes open, found Dr. Patel's face above him. She smiled, though her expression remained intense with concentration. "Welcome back. Now, let's fix that heart of yours, shall we? You've got a family out there counting on many more years with their stubborn grandfather." James felt the medication pulling him towards sleep, but this time it was different from the darkness that had tried to claim him. This was healing sleep, not the final kind. As his consciousness faded, he made a new promise. Not just to Margaret, this time, but to himself and his family. If he got through this, he'd learn a new kind of strength. The kind that wasn't about bearing pain alone, but about letting others help carry the load. Steel might not bend, but even the strongest structures needed supports to stay standing. "Beginning catheterization," he heard Dr. Patel say. "Stay with us, Mr. Miller. Your story's not over yet." The cardiac waiting room was a study in contained chaos. Sarah paced the length of the room, her teacher's composure cracking with each step. Michael stood at the window, still in his dust-covered clothes from the baseball field, his police training evident in his alert stance. Lisa sat perfectly still, her corporate mask firmly in place, one hand absently twisting her mother's old ring. "Family of James Miller." They converged on the nurse so quickly she took a step back. "Dr. Patel asked me to update you. Your father is in the catheterization lab. The procedure is underway, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There were some complications getting started. We lost his pulse briefly, but we got him back. He's stabilized now." Sarah's knees buckled. Michael caught her, guiding her to a chair. Lisa's professional facade cracked, a single tear tracking down her cheek. Lost his pulse. Michael's voice was hoarse. You mean He died, Lisa finished flatly. For how long? Less than 2 minutes, the nurse assured them. Dr. Patel is one of our best. She's working to clear the blockages now. Someone will update you as soon as there's more news. After the nurse left, silence fell heavy over the room. The children they'd left in the hospital's family room with Rachel in charge were texting constantly, desperate for updates. How did you tell children their grandfather's heart had stopped beating, even if only for minutes? I should have pushed harder, Sarah finally said, her voice thick with tears. All those times I saw him wincing, making excuses. I should have dragged him to the doctor myself. We all saw the signs, Michael responded, running a hand through his hair. Remember last month, when he had to sit down halfway through building that treehouse for the boys? He said it was just the heat. Lisa stood abruptly, her heels clicking against the linoleum as she paced. He's exactly like Mom was, remember? Always putting everyone else first, never wanting to worry us, and now... She stopped, pressing her hand against the window. We can't lose him too, not like this. A new voice cut through their grief. Mr. Miller's children? An older man in a white coat stood in the doorway, chart in hand. I'm Dr. Richards, the cardiac specialist. I'd like to discuss your father's condition in detail, if you're ready. They gathered around him as he pulled up a chair. The catheterization is still ongoing, but we've identified the extent of the damage. Your father has severe coronary artery disease. Multiple arteries are blocked, some almost completely. From the pattern we're seeing, he's likely been having small heart attacks. For months, possibly even minor ones over the past year. A year? Sarah's voice cracked. How did we not know? Heart disease can be insidious, Dr. Richards explained gently. Each small event causes a little damage, but the body adapts. People, especially strong-willed ones like your father appears to be, learn to work around the symptoms until something triggers a major event like today. Michael leaned forward, police detective mode engaging. What triggered it today? Emotional and physical stress, most likely. The excitement of the baseball game, standing up suddenly, it was enough to push an already compromised system over the edge. The doctor consulted his chart. Has your father ever mentioned chest pain, shortness of breath, unusual fatigue? The siblings exchanged looks, memories surfacing. James leaving Tommy's birthday party early because he was tired. Skipping his usual walk with Emma because the weather was too humid. The growing collection of antacids in his medicine cabinet. He explained everything away, Lisa said softly. Just like Mom did with the cancer. Always had a reasonable excuse. Dr. Richards nodded sympathetically. It's a common pattern, unfortunately. The good news is Dr. Patel is one of the best interventional cardiologists in Chicago. The procedure she's performing will clear the immediate blockages, but he held their gaze each in turn. This is just the beginning. Your father will need significant lifestyle changes, medication, cardiac rehabilitation. He's going to need support. He'll have it, Michael said firmly, whether he likes it or not. Good, because the next 24 hours are critical. Even after we clear the blockages, there's a risk of complications. His heart has sustained significant damage. Recovery will take time and patience, his and yours. A knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse entered, her expression carefully neutral. Dr. Richards? Dr. Patel needs you in cath lab 2. Mr. Miller's pressure is dropping again. The doctor stood quickly. Excuse me, I'll update you as soon as I can. Alone again, the siblings drew closer together, unconsciously seeking comfort in their proximity. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing a text from Rachel. The kids are asking about Grandpa. What should I tell them? The truth, Lisa said, surprising herself. Age-appropriate, but the truth. That's what Mom would have done. Michael nodded. That Grandpa is sick, but doctors are helping him. That he needs us to be strong for him now, like he's always been. Strong for us. And that we love him, Sarah added, typing. That we're not going anywhere. The waiting room clock ticked away minutes that felt like hours. Outside the window, Chicago continued its Saturday routine, oblivious to the drama unfolding. In the cardiac unit, Sarah thought about her father's workshop, probably still smelling of sawdust and machine oil, Emma's bike propped against the wall. Michael pictured his father in the bleachers, proud and strong one moment, terrifyingly vulnerable the next. Lisa remembered their last family dinner, the way he'd finally agreed to get help, too late to prevent this crisis, but perhaps not too late to prevent the next one. They were their father's children, strong, stubborn, dedicated to family above all else. But today had taught them that strength came in many forms. Sometimes it meant standing firm, like the steel beams their father had worked with all his life. Sometimes it meant bending, adapting, asking for help. Now they could only wait, hope, and pray that they'd get the chance to teach their father that lesson too. While their father fought for his life in the catheterization lab, Sarah and Lisa drove to his house to collect some essentials for what they knew would be an extended hospital stay. The familiar ranch-style home felt different now, heavy with unspoken warnings they'd all missed. "I'll check his bedroom," Sarah said, heading down the hallway. "Can you look through the bathroom cabinet? See what medications he's actually been taking?" Lisa nodded, pushing open the bathroom door. The medicine cabinet told its own story. Multiple bottles of antacids, some expired, some nearly empty. Behind them, partially hidden, she found something more concerning. A prescription bottle for nitroglycerin dated 6 months ago. It was almost full. "Sarah!" she called out, her hand shaking. "You need to see this." Her sister appeared in the doorway, clutching a worn leather journal they recognized as their father's work diary. Her face was pale. "I found something too." They met in the kitchen, spreading their discoveries on the table where they'd had family dinner just days ago. The prescription bottle sat accusingly between them. "He saw Dr. Patterson 6 months ago," Lisa said, reading the label. "Never told us, never even filled the other prescriptions. Look, the paperwork's still folded up inside the bag." Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands. "It's worse than that. Listen to this entry from last year. Chest pain again today, worse than usual. Should probably get it checked, but the Anderson project is behind schedule. Can't let the crew down. Margaret would give me hell for this." She flipped through more pages, each entry revealing a pattern of denial and rationalization. December 15th. Had to stop twice while carrying Christmas trees into the church. Pastor Bob noticed. Made excuses about the cold. January 3rd. That pressure in my chest is getting harder to ignore, but Michael's promotion ceremony is next week. Don't want to worry the kids. Lisa sank into a kitchen chair, her professional composure crumbling. He's been documenting his own decline, like he knew something was wrong but couldn't admit it. There's more. Sarah turned to a page marked with a hospital business card. He actually went to the emergency room 3 months ago. Middle of the night when none of us would know. They wanted to admit him for tests, but he signed himself out. Wrote here that he had to finish Emma's dollhouse. The sisters sat in silence, the weight of their father's hidden struggle pressing down on them. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, marking time in a house filled with evidence of James Miller's dedication to everyone but himself. "Look at this," Lisa said suddenly, pulling open a kitchen drawer. Inside were pamphlets about heart disease, warning signs of heart attacks, dietary recommendations, all picked up from various doctors' offices over the months, all apparently unread. Sarah picked up one, dated just weeks ago. He knew something was seriously wrong, but he just kept pushing through. "Like Mum with the cancer," Lisa whispered. "Remember how she hid the lumps until she couldn't anymore? It's exactly the same pattern." Their phones buzzed simultaneously. A text from Michael. "Dad's out of catheterization. Doctor wants to talk to all of us." As they gathered their father's new things, Sarah paused by the workshop door. Through the window, she could see Emma's bike, still propped where he'd left it yesterday. Next to it sat an unfinished birdhouse, the wood only partially sanded, tools laid out as if waiting for their owner's return. "We can't let him go back to hiding things," she said firmly. "Not again. Not after this." Lisa nodded, clutching the prescription bottle and journal. "These are coming with us. The doctors need to know everything, and Dad needs to understand he can't keep secrets like this anymore." They locked up the house, each carrying a bag of their father's belongings and the weight of his hidden struggles. The morning sun cast long shadows across the driveway where just days ago they'd gathered for a family dinner, unaware of the crisis building behind their father's strong facade. In the car, Lisa broke the heavy silence. "Think he'll ever forgive us for going through his things?" Sarah started the engine, her expression determined. "He'll have to, because we're not losing another parent to silence and stubbornness. Not if we can help it." The cardiac care waiting room had transformed in the hours since James went into surgery. Michael's wife, Jenny, had arrived with fresh clothes for everyone. Rachel had organized the younger kids in the family room, keeping them occupied with board, games, and steady updates. Even Mrs. Henderson, the nosy neighbor they'd criticized just days ago, had dropped off a basket of homemade sandwiches and coffee. "Family of James Miller?" Dr. Patel looked exhausted but satisfied as she approached them. She'd changed her scrubs, but fatigue lined her face after hours in the catheterization lab. The siblings gathered around her, joined by Jenny and Rachel, who'd left the younger children with a volunteer. "The procedure was successful," Dr. Patel began, and a collective breath of relief filled the room. "We placed several stents to open the blocked arteries. He's stable now, but—" She paused, making eye contact with each family member. "The damage to his heart muscle is extensive. Recovery will be challenging, but he will recover." Sarah's voice carried the question they all feared to ask. "With proper care and significant lifestyle changes, yes. However," she gestured to the journal and prescriptions Lisa and Sarah had brought back, "this pattern of ignoring symptoms and avoiding treatment has to stop. The next cardiac event could be fatal." Rachel, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Like Grandma." Her voice cracked slightly. "She did the same thing, didn't she? Kept everything to herself until it was too late." Jenny wrapped an arm around her niece's shoulders. At 15, Rachel was old enough to remember her grandmother's final days, old enough to understand the parallels everyone saw, but no one wanted to voice. "We found his journal," Lisa explained, handing it to Dr. Patel. "He's been tracking symptoms for months, maybe longer, but he kept making excuses, pushing through." The doctor nodded, scanning the entries. "This is actually quite helpful. It gives us a clearer picture of the progression." She looked up at the family. "Your father can be moved to a regular room soon. He'll be groggy from the medication, but you can see him briefly. Just remember, he's vulnerable right now, not just physically." After the doctor left, Michael pulled his sisters aside. "We need to talk about what happens next. He can't live alone, not right away." "He can stay with me," Sarah offered immediately. "I have the extra room since Emma's dad moved out." "It's not just about space," Lisa countered. "We need a plan. Cardiac rehab, medication management, lifestyle changes. You know, Dad, he'll try to take control the minute he feels slightly better, like he did with Mom." Michael added softly, "Remember how he tried to handle everything himself? Nearly ran himself into the ground before we forced him to accept help." Jenny joined them, her nurse's training evident in her practical approach. "We divide the responsibilities. Sarah has space for him to stay. I can help monitor his medical care. Lisa, you're the best at handling paperwork. You take on insurance and medical documents. And I'll coordinate with work," Michael said. "Take some family leave to help during the first few weeks." Rachel appeared with Tommy and Jack in tow, Emma clinging to her hand. The children's faces showed the strain of the day, but also the resilience that characterized the Miller family. "Is Grandpa going to be okay?" Emma's small voice carried across the room. Sarah knelt down to her daughter's level. "Yes, sweetie, but he's going to need our help for a while. All of our help." "Can I still show him my bike tricks when he's better?" Emma asked. "Of course you can," Michael assured her. "But we'll have to be patient. Grandpa needs time to heal. Like, When he fixes things in his workshop, Tommy suggested. He always says good work takes time. The adults exchanged glances, smiling at the innocent wisdom. Exactly like that, Lisa agreed. And this time, we're all going to help with the fixing. A nurse appeared in the doorway. He's asking for you. Just a few minutes now, he needs rest. As they moved toward James's room, Sarah caught Lisa's arm. We're not letting him push us away this time, no matter how much he protests. Lisa nodded, squeezing her sister's hand. No more lone wolf act. He taught us family comes first. Time for him to learn to take his own advice. Together, they walked toward their father's room, united in purpose if not yet certain of a path ahead. The Miller family had weathered crises before, but this time would be different. This time they would face it together, whether their stubborn patriarch liked it or not. James Miller's hospital room was a stark contrast to his familiar workshop. Instead of the comfort of wood shavings and tool racks, he was surrounded by beeping monitors and IV lines. He looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way his children had never seen before, the hospital gown unable to hide the leads monitoring his heart. Dr. Patel stood at the foot of his bed, X-rays and test results displayed on a tablet. The entire family had gathered for this meeting. Sarah, Michael and Lisa flanking their father's bed, while Jenny stood near the door, her nurse's training helping her process the medical details. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Patel began, her tone gentle but firm, "I want to be very clear about your condition. Your heart has sustained significant damage from multiple cardiac events over the past several months. The catheterization procedure revealed blockages in 3 major coronary arteries, which we've treated with stents." She turned the tablet to show them the before and after images. "These dark areas show where blood flow was restricted. The stents have restored circulation, but—" She paused, making sure she had James's full attention. "Approximately 30% of your heart muscle has been permanently damaged." James's hand tightened on the blanket. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning your heart is now working harder to do its job. You'll be more susceptible to fatigue, shortness of breath, and future cardiac events. This condition requires significant lifestyle changes and ongoing medical management." "How long until I can get back to my workshop?" James asked, his voice rough. Sarah reached for his hand, but Lisa spoke first. "Dad, we found your journal and the prescriptions you never filled. You've known something was wrong for months." James closed his eyes briefly, the monitors betraying his increased heart rate. "Didn't want to worry you kids, had everything under control." "Clearly not," Michael said, his police officer's directness showing through. "You nearly died, Dad, at my son's baseball game." "Mr. Miller," Dr. Patel interjected, "this isn't about blame, but understanding how we got here is crucial to preventing it from happening again." She pulled up another screen. "Your blood pressure and cholesterol levels are dangerously high. Combined with your family history and lifestyle factors, you're at high risk for another heart attack." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. James looked at each of his children, seeing the fear and determination in their faces. "So what happens now?" "Now we build a comprehensive treatment plan," Dr. Patel explained. "Medication to control blood pressure and prevent blood clots. A carefully monitored exercise program through cardiac rehabilitation, dietary changes, regular checkups. And most importantly," she emphasized, "no more ignoring symptoms or skipping medications." Jenny stepped forward. "I've already talked with the cardiac rehab team, Dad. They have a great program, and it's close to Sarah's house." "Sarah's house?" James frowned. "I have my own home." "Not for the first few months," Lisa said firmly. "We've already discussed it. You're staying with Sarah until you're stronger. End of discussion." The old James might have argued, might have insisted he could handle everything himself, but something had changed in that catheterization lab, in those moments when his heart had stopped and started again. He looked at his children, really looked at them, and saw not just the worried faces of his family, but reflections of Margaret, The same determination she'd shown when facing challenges. The same love that had held their family together through every crisis. "Your recovery will take time," Dr. Patel continued. 3 to 6 months of cardiac rehabilitation, regular monitoring, and gradual return to activities, but, she smiled slightly, with proper care and support, there's no reason you can't eventually return to your workshop. Modified activity levels, of course. "The kids miss you already," Sarah added softly. "Emma's been asking when she can show you her bike tricks." James felt moisture gathering in his eyes, something that hadn't happened since Margaret's funeral. "Guess I don't have much choice, do I?" "No, you don't," Lisa said, but her voice was gentle. "We're not losing you to stubbornness, Dad. Not like we lost Mom." Dr. Patel made some final notes in his chart. "I'll have the nurse bring in your medication schedule and dietary guidelines. We'll start cardiac rehab education tomorrow. For now, rest. Your family will make sure everything else is taken care of." As the doctor left, James looked at the worried but determined faces around him. He thought of his own father, who died young from a heart attack, leaving a family unprepared and struggling. He thought of Margaret, whose silent battle with cancer had taught them all the high price of pride. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Should have listened sooner." Michael squeezed his shoulder. "Just listen now, Dad. That's all we're asking." The heart monitor beeped steadily, marking the rhythm of a second chance none of them intended to waste. 3 days into James's hospital stay, the rhythm of recovery was disrupted by an unexpected discovery. Dr. Patel arrived for morning rounds, her typically composed expression tight with concern as she reviewed the latest test results. "Mr. Miller," she began, glancing at Sarah, who had taken to spending mornings with her father before her teaching day began. "The echocardiogram we did this morning showed something concerning. There's an irregularity in your heart valve that wasn't visible during the initial emergency." James sat straighter in his hospital bed, the movement causing a small grimace. "What kind of irregularity?" Dr. Patel pulled up the imaging on her tablet, showing them a grainy black-and-white video of James's beating heart. "This valve here isn't closing properly. It's likely been damaged by the series of heart attacks you experienced. The condition is making your heart work even harder than we initially thought." Sarah gripped her father's hand. "What does this mean for his recovery?" "It means we need to make a decision," Dr. Patel said carefully. "The valve needs to be repaired. We can try medication first, but given the extent of the damage—" She paused, making sure she had their full attention. "I believe surgical intervention would give us the best outcome." "Surgery?" James's voice cracked. "You just put those stents in, thought that fixed everything." "The stents restored blood flow, but this is a mechanical issue with the heart itself. Open heart surgery would allow us to repair the valve directly." Dr. Patel's expression softened. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but waiting could make the condition worse." Sarah was already texting her siblings. "How risky is the surgery?" "Any open heart procedure carries significant risks, especially given your father's recent cardiac events." "But," Dr. Patel added, "not operating carries its own risks. The damaged valve will continue to strain your heart, potentially leading to heart failure." James stared out the window, where construction cranes dotted the Chicago skyline. He'd spent his life building things, fixing things. Now his own body needed the kind of repairs he couldn't make with his trusted tools. "How long?" he asked finally. "To recover from this surgery?" "Full recovery takes 2 to 3 months, assuming no complications, but the alternative is a lifetime of increasing disability as your heart continues to weaken." Sarah's phone buzzed with responses from Michael and Lisa. "They're on their way," she said. "We should discuss this as a family." "No," James said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "This decision is mine." Dr. Patel nodded. "You're right, Mr. Miller. But your family's support will be crucial for recovery. The rehabilitation period is intensive. You'll need help with everything from mobility to medication management." James thought of his workshop again, of the half-finished projects waiting for his return. He thought of Emma's bike tricks, Tommy's baseball games, all the moments he might miss if his heart continued to fail. He remembered the terror in his family's eyes when he'd collapsed at the baseball field. "If we do this," he said slowly, "what are my chances? With your overall health and the quality of our surgical team, I'd say 70% chance of a full recovery. Without it," Dr. Patel let the silence speak for itself. The door opened as Michael and Lisa hurried in, both still in their work clothes. But before they could speak, James straightened his shoulders, looking more like his old self than he had in days. "Schedule the surgery," he said firmly. "I've spent my life building things to last. Time to do the same with this old heart of mine." The monitors beeped steadily as his children absorbed the news, their faces showing a mix of fear and relief. Their father, the man who'd spent months hiding his symptoms, was finally choosing to face his health head-on. "You're sure?" Sarah asked softly. James nodded, squeezing her hand. "Some repairs can't wait. Your mother taught us that the hard way." The night before James's scheduled surgery, everything went wrong. The initial warning came from a nurse doing routine vitals checks, her practice calm, slipping as she studied the blood pressure reading. "I need to get Dr. Patel," she said already, reaching for the wall phone. "Try to stay calm, Mr. Miller." James didn't feel calm. The pressure in his chest had been building for hours, different from his previous cardiac episodes, but worrying nonetheless. Lisa, who'd taken the night shift of the family's rotating vigil, set aside her laptop and moved closer to the bed. "Dad? What aren't you telling us?" Before he could answer, Dr. Patel strode in, immediately checking the monitors. Her expression confirmed their fears. "Your blood pressure's spiking, and these ECG changes are concerning. When did the discomfort start?" "Few hours ago," James admitted. "Thought it was just pre-surgery jitters." Dr. Patel's fingers flew across her tablet, ordering new tests. "This could be a reaction to the preoperative medications, or..." She left the darker possibilities unspoken. "We need to get this under control before we can proceed with surgery." The next hour became a blur of activity. Blood draws, medication, adjustments, another ECG. Lisa called her siblings, her corporate crisis management skills keeping her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "His body's under significant stress," Dr. Patel explained to the gathered family as midnight approached. "The valve deterioration may be accelerating. We need to postpone surgery until he's stabilized." "But he needs the surgery," Michael protested. "You said waiting was dangerous. Operating right now would be more dangerous." Dr. Patel's tone left no room for argument. "We're moving him back to intensive care for monitoring. The next 24 hours are critical." Sarah, who'd rushed to the hospital still wearing her teaching clothes, grabbed the doctor's arm. "Critical how? His heart is struggling to compensate for the damaged valve. If we can't get his blood pressure under control and reduce the strain..." She met their eyes in turn. "We could lose our window for surgery entirely." James watched his children absorb this news, saw the same fear he'd put in their eyes at the baseball field. But this time was different. This time he wouldn't hide his symptoms or pretend everything was fine. "It feels like pressure," he said clearly, drawing their attention. "Here," he touched his chest. "Not pain exactly, but like something's not working right." Jenny, who'd come straight from her nursing shift at another hospital, nodded encouragingly. "Good, Dad. What else?" "Bit dizzy, short of breath when I try to sit up." The admission felt like surrender and victory all at once. "Started around dinner time, but got worse after evening medications." Dr. Patel made rapid notes. "This is exactly what we need to know. The more information we have, the better we can stabilize you." The move to ICU seemed to take both forever and no time at all. New monitors were attached, additional IV lines inserted. Through it all, James kept talking, reporting every twinge and sensation. Each admission felt like removing a brick from the wall of silence he'd built around himself. "We'll monitor through the night," Dr. Patel said as they settled him in the ACU. "Try to rest. The more stable you are, the sooner we can reschedule surgery." Later, as midnight passed into early morning, James watched his children take turns dozing in the ICU's uncomfortable chairs. None of them would leave, despite his insistence. The same stubborn dedication he'd always shown reflected back at him through the next generation. The monitors beeped steadily, marking each beat of his struggling heart. In the artificial quiet of the ICU, James made another kind of repair. Not with tools and timber, but with truth and trust. Every symptom shared, every worry voiced, became another step toward healing the habits of a lifetime. Now they just had to hope his heart would hold together long enough for surgery to make those repairs permanent. 48 hours after the crisis, James's condition finally stabilized enough for surgery. The pre-dawn hospital corridors were quiet as the family gathered in his room, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken fears and desperate hope. "The surgical team is ready," Dr. Patel announced, reviewing his latest vitals. "Your numbers look better, Mr. Miller. Blood pressure's holding steady, and the medication adjustments seem to be working." James sat propped up in bed, looking fragile, in his surgical gown, but more alert than he'd been during the crisis. The grandchildren had been allowed a brief visit before being sent to the waiting room with Rachel. Now it was time for the adults to say their temporary goodbyes. "The surgery should take about 4 hours," Dr. Patel explained. "Dr. Reynolds is our best cardiac surgeon. He's performed this particular valve repair hundreds of times." Lisa, who'd researched everything about the procedure, nodded. "And the bypass machine? We'll take over your father's heart and lung function during the repair. We'll be monitoring every vital sign continuously." She turned to James. "Are you ready?" James looked at his children, seeing the same fear in their eyes that he felt in his chest. But there was something else too: strength, determination, the unwavering support that had carried them through the past few days. "Almost," he said. "Need a minute with my kids first." Dr. Patel nodded, understanding. "I'll be back in 5 minutes, then we need to get started." When she left, James gestured his children closer. "Been thinking about your mother a lot these past few days. About the things she wanted to say at the end but couldn't." He swallowed hard, not making that mistake. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks. "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm. "Michael, you became the kind of father I always wanted to be. The way you put your family first, even with your dangerous job. I'm proud of you, son." Michael's police officer composure cracked slightly. "Dad, Lisa," James continued, "you got your mother's strength. The way you've handled everything since the divorce, raised Rachel on your own. You're amazing, sweetheart. Never told you." "Enough." Lisa gripped his hand, her corporate exterior falling away completely. "And Sarah," he turned to his eldest, "you held this family together after we lost your mother. Now you're doing it again, taking me in, organizing everything." He had to pause, emotion making his voice rough. "You're just like her. She'd be so proud of all of you." Jenny stepped forward, ever practical despite her own tears. "They're going to be here soon to take you up, Dad. You need to stay calm." James nodded. "One more thing. In my workshop, top drawer of my desk. There's letters there. Wrote them during those nights I couldn't sleep, when the pain was bad but I was too stubborn to admit it. One for each of you, one for each grandkid. Just in case." "Stop," Michael said firmly. "We'll read them when you're recovered, all of us together." "Including you," Lisa added, squeezing his hand. A nurse appeared in the doorway with a stretcher. "It's time, Mr. Miller." The transfer from bed to stretcher was handled with practiced efficiency. As they began wheeling him toward the surgical floor, James caught one last glimpse of his family. Sarah's quiet strength, Michael's protective stance, Lisa's determined expression, all of them showing the best parts of Margaret, the best parts of himself. "Wait," he called suddenly. The stretcher stopped. "The kids, tell them Grandpa's getting his heart fixed proper this time. No more quick fixes." "They know, Dad," Sarah smiled through her tears. "Emma says you'll be better than new." "Smart girl," James managed, his own eyes moist. "Takes after her mother." The elevator doors opened, and the moment of parting arrived. Each child stepped forward for a final quick hug. mindful of the IV lines and monitors. No one said goodbye. That word carried too much weight after their experience with Margaret. "See you soon, Dad," Michael said firmly. "Few hours," Lisa added. "We'll be right here," Sarah finished. As the stretcher moved into the elevator, James kept his eyes on his children until the doors closed. The last thing he saw was their united front, standing together just as they had through every crisis. Life had thrown at them. The surgical floor button lit up, and James closed his eyes, sending up a silent prayer, not for himself, but for the family he wasn't ready to leave. Not yet, not like this. The cardiac surgical suite hummed with controlled tension. Dr. Reynolds stood over James's unconscious form, his experienced hands steady as he made the initial incision. Monitors beeped in careful rhythm, tracking every vital sign as the surgical team worked with practiced precision. In the waiting room, the Miller family had settled into their vigil. Sarah graded papers without really seeing them, red pen hovering over unmarked essays. Michael paced, his police instincts making him hyper-aware of every passing doctor. Lisa had set up a makeshift office in the corner, her laptop open but untouched. Family. Of James Miller, they looked up to see a surgical nurse in blue scrubs. "We're at the 2-hour mark," she reported. "Everything's proceeding as expected. Dr. Reynolds has accessed the valve and is beginning the repair." The collective breath of relief was short-lived. Barely 15 minutes later, a change in the surgical suite's atmosphere signaled trouble. "Pressure's dropping," the anesthesiologist announced, his calm voice masking urgency. "Heart rate becoming irregular." Dr. Reynolds' focus intensified. "Could be reaction to bypass. Increase support and watch those numbers." His skilled hands never paused in their delicate work on the valve. "How long on bypass?" 2 hours? 17 minutes. "Let's pick up the pace. Don't want him on too long." The next update to the family was more guarded. "There have been some challenges," the nurse explained carefully. "Dr. Reynolds is handling them, but the surgery is taking longer than anticipated." Sarah caught the undertone of concern. "What kind of challenges?" "Your father's heart is showing some stress from the bypass machine. It's not uncommon, but we're monitoring it closely." Back in surgery, the situation was becoming more critical. "BP still falling," the anesthesiologist reported. "Getting PVCs. Heart's not happy," Dr. Reynolds muttered. "Need about 20 more minutes to complete this repair. Can we maintain him?" The surgical team worked with increased urgency, each person focused on their specific role in keeping James stable. The valve repair was delicate work under the best circumstances. Under pressure, it became a race against time. In the waiting room, Jenny's nursing experience made her especially attuned to the subtle shifts in hospital rhythm. She noticed the increased activity around the surgical wing, the quick steps of additional staff being called in. "Something's wrong," she whispered to Michael. "They're calling in backup." Inside the OR, Dr. Reynolds' experience was being put to the ultimate test. "Getting some bleeding here. Suction. More light." His voice remained steady, even as the monitors showed increasingly concerning readings. "Vitach," the warning came, sharp and clear. "Push 1 of amiodarone," Dr. Reynolds ordered. "Come on, James. Not now. We're almost there." The family's anxiety grew with each passing hour. The updates became shorter, less detailed. Rachel had taken the younger children to the hospital cafeteria, trying to keep them occupied while the adults maintained their tense vigil. "BP's stabilizing," the anesthesiologist finally reported. "Rhythms improving." Dr. Reynolds allowed himself a small breath of relief. "Good. Let's close carefully. This man's got family waiting." Time seemed to move differently in the waiting room, stretching and contracting with each passing minute. Sarah had given up any pretense of grading, Lisa had abandoned her work calls, and Michael had worn a path in the floor with his pacing. Finally, after what seemed like eternity, Dr. Reynolds appeared in his surgical scrubs, his face showing both fatigue and cautious satisfaction. He made it through, he told the family. The valve repair was successful, though we had some challenging moments. The next 24 hours will be critical, but he allowed himself a small smile. Your father is one tough man. The tension that had held the family rigid for hours began to ease. Sarah found herself crying silently. Lisa gripped her hand, and Michael finally stopped pacing. "When can we see him?" Sarah asked. "He's in recovery now. Once he's moved to ICU, you can visit briefly. He'll be sedated on a ventilator, but talking to him helps. He'll know you're there." As the surgeon left, the family drew together, supporting each other as they had throughout this ordeal. Their father had survived the surgery, but they all knew this was just the beginning of a long recovery. "He's going to make it," Michael said firmly, holding his sisters close. "Dad's too stubborn not to." The waiting room clock ticked past another hour, marking the beginning of the next phase of their journey, the critical period where they would discover just how successful the surgery had been and what kind of recovery lay ahead. The cardiac ICU was a maze of equipment, each machine monitoring a different aspect of James's fragile recovery. The ventilator hissed rhythmically, breathing for him while his body recovered from the trauma of surgery. Tubes and wires created a complex web around his still form, making him seem smaller and more vulnerable than his family had ever seen him. "The first 12 hours are crucial," Dr. Reynolds explained, checking the latest readings. "His body's been through significant trauma. The repaired valve is functioning well, but we need to watch for complications." Sarah sat closest to the bed, her hand resting gently on her father's arm between the IV lines. The others had arranged themselves around the room, Michael by the door as if standing guard, Lisa near the window, Jenny checking each monitor. With professional understanding, the first sign of trouble came shortly before midnight. One of the monitors began chirping an irregular rhythm, drawing immediate attention from the ICU staff. "Blood pressure's climbing," the night nurse announced, already moving to adjust medications. "Heart rate's erratic." Dr. Patel, who had stayed late to monitor her patient, rushed in to assess the situation. Could be pain breaking through or his body reacting to coming off bypass. "Increase the sedation and let's get another ECG." Family was ushered out while the medical team worked. In the hallway, they clung to each other, the earlier relief of successful surgery giving way to renewed fear. "He was doing so well," Sarah whispered. "The surgery worked. The valve was fixed." "Surgery's just the beginning," Jenny explained gently. "His heart's been replumbed. It needs time to adjust to the new normal." Inside the room, the medical team fought to stabilize their patient. James's body, already weakened by months of untreated cardiac issues, was struggling to adapt to the repaired valve. "Pressure's still rising," the nurse reported. "Arrhythmia's getting worse." Dr. Patel made rapid adjustments to his medication. "Come on, Mr. Miller. You got through the hard part. Don't give up on us now." As if in response to her words, the monitors began to show improvement. The erratic beeping steadied, the numbers slowly returning to acceptable ranges. "That's it," Dr. Patel encouraged, though she knew James couldn't hear her through the sedation. "Small steps. Let the medications help you." When the family was allowed back in, they found Dr. Patel studying the new ECG printout. "This episode was concerning," she admitted. "But how he responds to these challenges in the next few hours will tell us a lot about his recovery path." "What do we do?" Michael asked, his protective instincts in overdrive. "Talk to him," Dr. Patel suggested. "Even sedated, patients often respond to family voices. Tell him what he has to live for." They took turns at his bedside, each finding their own ways to reach through the sedation. Sarah talked about Emma's upcoming dance recital, how she was practicing every day to show her grandpa her new moves. Michael described Tommy's latest baseball game, promising to bring the game ball his son had saved, especially for his grandfather. Lisa read emails from Rachel, who had taken the younger children home but was keeping constant touch. Through the night, James's vital signs continued their precarious dance between stability and crisis. Each small victory, a steadier heart rhythm, improved oxygen levels, was celebrated. Each setback brought renewed fear and determination. "Remember when he taught us to ride bikes?" Lisa said during one particularly tense moment. "He never used training wheels. Said we had to learn by doing, but he never let go until we were ready." Sarah smiled at the memory. "And he'd run alongside, pretending we were doing it all ourselves." "That's what we're doing now," Michael realized. "Running alongside, letting him think he's fighting this alone, but we're not letting go, not until he's ready." The monitors beeped steadily, marking each moment of James Miller's fight. The repaired valve was doing its job, but his heart needed to remember how to work with this new configuration, how to trust the fix that had been forced upon it. Just before dawn, Dr. Patel noted a subtle but significant change in the readings. "His body's starting to adapt," she said with cautious optimism. "The next few hours will be critical, but—" She smiled at the family. "I think he's finally letting us help him heal." The sun began to rise over Chicago's skyline, painting the ICU room in shades of hope. James remained still under sedation, but the machines told a story of gradual improvement, of a heart learning to work with its repairs rather than against them. 24 hours after surgery, Dr. Patel began reducing James's sedation. The family watched anxiously for any sign of consciousness, each small movement bringing both hope and anxiety. The ventilator remained in place, but his body was doing more of the breathing work on its own. "The process is gradual," Dr. Patel explained. "We don't want to rush his system, but all his numbers are trending in the right direction." Sarah had dozed off in her chair when she felt a slight pressure on her hand. Her eyes flew open to find her father's fingers twitching against hers. His eyes remained closed, but there was purpose in the movement. "Dad," she whispered, afraid to hope too much. "Dad, can you hear me?" The pressure increased slightly. Dr. Patel, who had been checking his latest readings, moved quickly to his bedside. "Mr. Miller, if you can hear me, squeeze Sarah's hand again." The response was weak but definite. Michael and Lisa crowded closer as their father's eyes fluttered, fighting against days of sedation. "Don't try to talk," Dr. Patel cautioned. "You're on a ventilator to help you breathe. Just take it slow, squeeze once for yes, twice for no. Do you know where you are? 1 squeeze. Do you remember the surgery? 2 squeezes. That's normal," Dr. Patel assured them. "The medications affect memory. Mr. Miller, you're in the ICU. The surgery was successful. Your heart valve has been repaired. Are you in any pain?" A pause, then 1 squeeze. "I'll adjust your medication. You're doing very well." Dr. Patel turned to the family. "This is excellent progress. If he continues improving, we can try removing the ventilator later today." Throughout the morning, James became increasingly alert. His eyes tracked movement, responding to his children's voices. The medical team ran tests, checking his neurological function and cardiac response. Everything indicated a strong recovery. Afternoon, Dr. Patel decided he was ready to try breathing on his own. "This will be uncomfortable," she warned as she prepared to remove the ventilator. "But you've been breathing more and more by yourself. You're ready." The procedure was quick but distressing to watch. James coughed and gasped as the tube was withdrawn, his face contorting with discomfort. But when it was done, the monitors showed strong, steady breathing. "Ice," he whispered, his voice rough from the tube. Lisa spooned a few chips between his lips while Jenny adjusted his oxygen cannula. The simple act of swallowing seemed to exhaust him, but his eyes remained alert. Moving from face to face, "The kids," his second words, barely audible but clear in their concern. "They're fine," Sarah assured him. "Rachel's been amazing with them. They made you cards. Want to see?" He managed a small nod, and Lisa held up Emma's artistic creation. A heart drawn in bright red crayon with "Get Better Grandpa" written in careful first-grade letters. Tommy and Jack had collaborated on a baseball-themed card, while Rachel's showed more artistic skill, but the same loving message. "Strong kids," James whispered, "like their parents." Michael wiped moisture from his eyes. Like their grandfather, Dr. Patel returned to check his latest readings. Cardiac function is improving steadily. The repaired valve is working well. How's your pain level, Mr. Miller? And this time I want the truth. A ghost of James's old smile crossed his face. Hurts, but telling you, progress indeed, Dr. Patel smiled. We'll adjust your medications. The more honest you are about your symptoms, the better we can help you heal. As the day progressed, James managed longer periods of wakefulness. Each small achievement, sipping water, shifting position slightly, staying awake for more than a few minutes, was celebrated by his family and medical team alike. You know what this reminds me of? Lisa said during a quiet moment. When you were teaching us to build things, how you always said the finishing work was as important as the foundation. James nodded slightly. Good analogy. His voice was stronger now, though speaking still took effort. Building strength back. One day at a time, Sarah added, squeezing his hand. Together, James finished, the word carrying more meaning than its 2 syllables should allow. Outside the window, Chicago's afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of healing. The monitors beeped steadily, telling the story of a heart learning to work with its repairs, of a man learning to accept help, of a family growing stronger through crisis. James Miller, builder of skyscrapers and family bonds, was beginning his own reconstruction. The foundation was solid, built on medical skill, family love, and newfound wisdom about what true strength really meant. 6 weeks after surgery, James sat in Sarah's sunlit living room, watching Emma practice her bike tricks through the window. His chest still ached where they'd opened his rib cage, but the pain was different now, healing rather than warning. The coffee table in front of him held neat rows of medication bottles, each one carefully labeled in Jenny's precise nursing handwriting. A cardiac rehabilitation schedule hung on the refrigerator, marked with his progress. 3 times a week, Michael or Lisa would drive him to the sessions, where he slowly rebuilt his strength under watchful professional eyes. Ready for your walk, Dad? Sarah asked, coming in from her morning classes. These short walks had become their ritual, each day going a little further than the last. Been ready, James replied, carefully pushing himself up from the chair. The motion was getting easier, though he still needed to be mindful of his healing. Sternum. Think I can make it to the corner today? Sarah handed him his light jacket. Chicago's spring still carried a chill. The corner, maybe, but no further until Dr. Patel clears you. James didn't argue. The past weeks had taught him a new kind of strength, the strength to accept limitations, to allow help, to put recovery ahead of pride. Each small victory, from taking his first unassisted steps to remembering all his medications without prompting, felt more meaningful than any skyscraper he'd ever built. As they walked slowly down the sidewalk, James thought about the half-finished projects in his workshop, waiting for the day he'd be strong enough to return. But for now, this was enough. This quiet morning with his daughter, this steady healing, this second chance he'd almost lost to stubbornness. 3 months after surgery, James stood in his workshop for the first time since that morning he'd fixed Emma's bike. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Tools arranged with precision, projects waiting patiently for his return. But he was different now, changed not just by the scars on his chest, but by the lessons carved into his heart. Ready. Grandpa? Emma called from the doorway. She wore her bike helmet, practically bouncing with excitement. Dr. Patel had finally cleared him for light workshop activities, and his first project would be adjusting Emma's bike seat for her summer growth spurt. Almost, sweetheart, he replied, running his hand along the familiar workbench. Sarah watched from the doorway, ready to step in if he needed help. But James had learned his limits now, knew when to push and when to rest. He picked up his wrench, the same one he'd been using when that last major chest pain hit. But this time, he also reached for his phone, where his cardiac rehabilitation app tracked his activity levels. The medication reminder on his watch would buzz in 20 minutes. Small changes, but they meant everything. "You know what, Emma?" he said, gesturing her closer. "Think it's time I taught you how to use these tools yourself. Every good builder needs an apprentice." Sarah smiled, remembering similar lessons from her own childhood. But this time was different. This time, her father was building something more important than furniture or toys. He was building a legacy of wisdom, teaching his granddaughter. The true strength meant knowing when to accept help, when to slow down, when to put family before pride. Some lessons came with too high a price to be forgotten.